Hi everybody, I'm Jessica Murray, coordinating producer for Pellet Media and Engaging Students. Pellet Media has been creating free educational resources for students and teachers for more than 20 years. Today I'm excited to speak with Dr. Christoph Winkler. He's the Heinz Endowed Professor and Founding Program Director at the Heinz Institute for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York. A well-respected leader in entrepreneurship education, Dr. Winkler has pushed boundaries and re-envisioned traditional academic practices throughout his career. Today we're discussing the change to remote instruction during a period of uncertainty as colleges remain closed because of COVID-19. Hello, Christoph, welcome.
Hi, Jessica. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you and share some of my insights and reflections in response to the current COVID-19 crisis. It has been a lot of activity, particularly through different communication channels about how to best respond to these kinds of situations, and I think the colleges overall had different kinds of approaches, and it would be great sort of to explore together some of these issues as they have come about, but also to reflect about what has been done in terms of responses, but also give additional insights in terms of how different colleges and college professors in particular can respond as they adjust their teaching to online learning.
Excellent. Well, we're so glad to have you. And we were able to connect a little bit yesterday. And one thing I'd like to ask you about is your thoughts on class goals and learning outcomes right now. Initially I saw a lot of resources geared toward the technical aspect of this shift, and then maybe a swing in the other direction with people saying, that doesn't matter. All we need to do is care for our students at this moment. Can you talk about how you bridge maybe these two outlooks?
So I think one phenomenon that has happened was really that a lot of people try to hold on to particular technologies and use the technology as an entry point to convert their classes into online education. And as an educational psychologist, this sometimes startles me because I think that technology shouldn't be the entry point in order for us to create a learning environment. It always has to be the learning objective that I would like to achieve in my particular classroom, however we define a classroom, whether it's in person, whether it's online, or some kind of variation. So what I always caution is that the entry point shouldn't be the technology or the technological capabilities. It should always be the learning objective. So in order to do this, I think it's important to take a step back, to really carefully examine the courses and the course modules that somebody is about to convert and trying to deliver through a new format, and then try to find ways, pedagogical considerations paired with some technological design considerations of what could work best in order to deliver on the promise of that learning objective. And I think once we have that kind of conversation, we are better equipped to actually structure the classroom in ways that allow us to achieve those learning objectives. Because sometimes it was what I've observed, everybody's like, okay, now we deliver all of our courses using Zoom. And while Zoom is a great tool and has lots of capabilities that I think are very useful for online education, sometimes there may be a better way to adjust our classroom by not using a synchronous tool, but using an asynchronous approach to discussion board, reflective essays, or some independent research. So there's different ways of how we need to examine that kind of design question. And I think as we move forward, we should continuously examine our own practices and be true to our own mission as we create those learning spaces.
So this is kind of a great segue into a question about your own classes. So, what are you doing in your classes? How are your students doing with everything? And what are you learning from what you're seeing with them?
I would like to pair this maybe from two different perspectives. One is how I've been, dealing with online education over the past 20 years since I was first introduced to online learning. And I think it's important to understand that similar to what I said earlier, that whatever you design needs to be solely or exclusively focused, particularly right now, on what I would like my students to do, but also understanding the new circumstances in which we find ourselves in. I often say that the students that we said goodbye to before, in our case, before spring break about 2 weeks ago, were quite different from the students that came back now. Not in terms of their name and their student ID number, but the circumstances, the contextual parameters have changed. A student who was living in a dorm and had a dedicated study space may now find him or herself at home with 2 other siblings who need to share one computer in order to access their online resources. So I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. So what I've been doing as it relates to some of the work at the Heinz Institute at Iona College is really apply a design thinking approach to carefully start with building empathy with our students, truly understanding where they are right now, physically, but also in terms of their mental capacity, in order to structure the learning and adjusting the learning environment in order to best give them the opportunities to learn successfully. So that's something that I've been doing. I've been teaching online for quite some time. Right now, I concluded my personal teaching responsibilities at the college since we are at the graduate level a trimester schedule. But I've been guest lecturing and working with some of my colleagues in order to help support building their own capabilities. And just to give an example, I taught a design thinking class about 2 days ago in our occupational therapy program. And I had a different exercise plan for an in-classroom activity. And again, it applied the same principles. What is it that I wanted my students to understand? How can I translate this learning objective into an experience online that would give the students a similar experience? So what happened was we used a Zoom session with breakout rooms. We engaged in a deep conversation by using sort of a retrospective approach, by using a field experience, bringing this back into the class, having students work in groups, and then develop ideas and projects as a result of that engagement, as a class, but also as a group in those breakout sessions. And I would argue that the refinement of that approach in this particular class yielded a very positive result, something that I think mirrors the in-classroom experience, and really challenged myself also to really bridge the dynamics of the classroom, the technology, but also in terms of the students' anxiety by now being in an online environment while they're still trying to adjust to their personal situation. And the one thing I would like to add to this, every class, but also every meeting that I've had with my team spends at least 5 to 10, sometimes 15 minutes by just asking how the students, how the people in that meeting are doing. I think particularly right now that is very important. But even in general, if we were not in a COVID-19 situation, always using this as an entry point to understand, are the students where they're supposed to be? Is there something that I need to extract from them in order to inform my teaching, my approach, and be adaptable in a way that really gives them the best chances of learning?
Excellent, thank you. Since you just mentioned entrepreneurship there, I want to touch on that as one of your research areas. How do you define an entrepreneurial mindset in the context of education? How does having one help educators and students, who are struggling right now?
Entrepreneurship education, I think there's kinds of 2 opposite poles in how we envision this. And there's different camps that favor one approach versus the other. More traditional approaches like entrepreneurship education is geared towards helping students start businesses. We've seen a gradual shift towards mindset education by looking at entrepreneurship education, and entrepreneurship is a much broader skill set that students need to have in order to have what I would call a sense of agency, an agency for learning, an empowerment to seek opportunities, and also not only seek these opportunities, but act on those opportunities based upon the skill sets that we have, but also in terms of the ones that you need to develop in order to be in a position to act on those opportunities. And this is really something that, particularly right now, is a strong skill I think that everybody needs to have as we deal with this high level of uncertainty, we need to not only look at the fallout from this entire crisis that sort of impacts our lives, but also look at the opportunities that we now present ourselves. So within the context of education, I would sort of separate those two in those two categories, where we as educators need to be applying an entrepreneurial mindset to the task. We cannot just assume that we are the sage on the stage communicating content and our perceived sort of priorities in order to help students support their learning. I think we need to be also humble in our own approach in order to adjust our way of teaching by challenging ourselves to see, like, what is it that I'm really good at, and how can I translate this into an even better experience in order to help support our students? What is it that I still need to build capabilities around? So if I'm a class A in-class lecturer, but I have really hard time translating this into an online environment, or maybe I shouldn't be doing it in online. Maybe I shouldn't lecture online. Maybe I try to find something else. So having those kinds of conversations, again, being adaptive, seeking opportunities for learning, and as a result, improving your own practice of teaching by honing your skill and continuously developing. And that's a tough thing sometimes for us educators, particularly for the more experienced ones, where your expertise is now being challenged because you're not entering a new and uncharted territory. And this is essentially what entrepreneurship is, right? I now have a new set of circumstances, and now can demonstrate my own leadership and skill set in that environment. On the student side, it applies the same way. I send my students a note to motivate them and not look at this as make attributions as it relates to the situation, that this is something external, I can do nothing about it. I want them to embrace a growth mindset, to really say, this is something that I can do. And if I don't know how to do it, I will do it at some point, because I just don't know how to do it yet, but I will be able to do it. So sort of emphasizing the growth mindset, sort of prompting students to carefully investigate and examine their current practices in terms of how they learn, how they build routines around learning, how they think about the future and sort of their place within that sort of envisioned future as to create sort of their own impact statements. How this now is being challenged and changed, and really using this again as an opportunity to carefully examine their own place, rediscovering or reinforcing a sense of agency, and doing it themselves, seeking the help that they need, and ultimately through sort of that approach, build new skills and further develop the entrepreneurial mindset, which I think is a critical skill as we look at the workforce in particular. So it doesn't matter whether a student starts a business or works for a company. I think an entrepreneurial mindset will be critical in the future as well as it is now.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christoph. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. I want to come back to all of the resources that are out there. And as you pointed out when we were chatting yesterday, a lot of these are not new, right? They are existing things. And so, how are these resources, the increased circulation, what do you see as some of the long-term effects of that? And the other thing I'm kind of curious about is, despite this, proliferation of availability and awareness, are there things that are missing? What kind of are there still resources missing from what's circulating?
So, one thing that I've also noticed and that I didn't mention earlier is that, because of this new situation, a lot of vendors who have been operating in that space, because there have been a lot of tools out there, also were, stepping up and seizing the opportunity, like everybody, promised the panacea of online education. We got this sort of silver bullet in order to help you remedy the ailment of this crisis, is particularly the people who have not built the capabilities around developing and delivering online education. I would argue most universities have actually been pretty well prepared in order to have the basic tools in place that you would need, whether it is related to online synchronous or as well as asynchronous education, whether it's course management systems such as Blackboard or Canvas, whether it is Zoom or Skype or Microsoft suites, So the tools have been pretty much in place. And there's a strong, I think, knowledge base around how to use these tools from a technical perspective, but also in terms of best practices of how people have been using those in the classrooms. So I think that was something that I think was now magnified in a way where people who have been more hesitant about these kinds of tools were not forced to carefully examine those. Of course, this was clouded now with many, many other vendors who have also great tools available. And the challenge often was for people to sort through all that and really figure out something that works for them. Years ago, I did a study. I never published a study. It was part of my PhD work, where I did a survey about the use of technology in the classroom that I did at a community college. And not surprisingly, but it was interesting to find that the only predictor of use of a technology in the classroom was its perceived utility. So what does this mean? Well, if I don't find this thing useful, I'm not going to use it. And the only way for me to find out that it's useful, actually, to start using it. So it was sort of a catch-22 in a way, where a lot of people were hesitant to use certain things because of that, didn't feel they were useful. But once they're using it, some felt like, oh, this works, and this doesn't work. Again, comes back to earlier what I said, this continuous improvement of practice that I think is important. And I would argue there's no one best solution in order to deliver online. I think important is that the tools allow us to provide a safe space where students can learn. Right? I need to have a dedicated course shell. I need to be able to have students communicate with each other, communicate with me, have a centralized location where assignments are being curated, where they're being shared, but also where they are being received in terms of the grading. So to have sort of the administrative pieces in place. But then there's a lot of gray area in between, right? And you may have the foundational element of the course management learning platform, but I point out things. I use a business model Canvas tool called Canvanizer, which is an independent sort of third-party website where my students create those business models. I use worksheets that the students sort of fill out on PDFs and submit those. I use sometimes Twitter in the classroom where we communicate with each other. I wrote a paper on this once about how to use Twitter as a social listening tool in order to really see what's going on out there and filter through some of that information, in order to identify trends and participate in a conversation and build some kind of a social following. So again, there's different tools that you can combine. But none of this matters unless you have actually a careful examination about what you would like to achieve in the classroom. And that's really sort of the most difficult part. In terms of gaps, I think the biggest gap that I would argue right now is really a clear understanding about where everybody is as it relates to in the classroom. We are sort of creatures of habit, so we are comfortable with certain technologies than others, and I think because of the large proliferation, it's also very difficult to integrate. So the question is, how can we create a more seamless integration of different tools in order to make it easier for students to navigate through different spaces? Because I often find that the technology or the access to technology prevents students from learning and actually prevents them from utilizing technology in the way that is most beneficial to their learning. In other words, if I can't log into my system, I need 3 logins for 3 different things. I use up all this time that I could actually spend on the content and the learning. So I think that integration, because of the proliferation, is something that I think is probably the biggest challenge right now. Maybe something that we will never solve because there's innovation happening. And I don't really believe that sometimes large systems that offer everything are really equipped to deliver everything, because once you have everything, I would argue sometimes have not nothing, but you only use a small fragment of that tool. I use my first example with Blackboard. You use the announcements page, the file sharing, the discussion boards, the blogs, and maybe wikis. If I use those tools and save assign in terms of getting assignments. But these are the 6 features that I use. When you look at the course, tools that you could use, the list is extensive. And with publishers having sort of add-on packages and whatnot, so you could expand and explode in a way that gets very, very difficult. So again, the biggest trick is to really create a sort of a concise, integrated way that allows students to navigate different technologies. But again, none of this matters if the learning objectives are not realized through that technology implementation.
Thank you, Christoph. I love how it just keeps kind of coming back to this focus on the learning goals, and also in the kind of context of knowing where your students are at this moment to really align those with those goals. Before I wrap this up, any last, comments, ideas, things you want to throw out that I didn't get to?
Yeah, two things that I think are often overlooked, because when we talk about learning goals, we need to talk about assessment. So, a lot of people struggling with, with group assignments, it's online, who's doing that work. And I think we need to find our own comfort level in terms of how we not only, create the assignments that we then ultimately would assess, but also create ways and creative ways to move more towards a formative assessment practice, towards portfolio assessments where I can actually see how the students gradually develop over time, as opposed to have a summative exam that I need to administer with a ProctorU tool, like in our case, where students have to scan their learning space, which sometimes is also an infringement on their privacy, particularly if you are at home in a space right now. We need to show everybody what you have there. So I think there's some privacy concerns on the one hand, but also sort of concerns related to the academic integrity. By the same token, I think through a more formative assessment practice that accumulates over time through portfolios and multiple credentials along the way as the students sort of complete the courses will sort of add up to a whole. And I think it's more difficult for anybody to sort of take advantage of sort of a single exam kind of situation, but really proactively participate, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. And the second item is a notion of accessibility. And maybe that's one of the biggest issues that I think we'll face, in addition to sort of this proliferation, integration piece, is also making sure that accessibility is assured for all of our students. And this means in terms of having the proper ADA requirements, but also accessibility in terms of students, if they work from home, who don't have Wi-Fi or internet access, how can I provide access to that? How can I assure that students can participate in this more resource-intensive environment, particularly when they are not on campus? And so, for example, in our case, we have guidelines of how students can access free Wi-Fi services, how we can distribute laptops to the students who actually don't have access or need additional help and support. So I think being prepared as an institution to give students to have an equitable approach in order for students to access online learning, I think is one of the most essential questions that we need to answer. And that's something that I think from a policy perspective needs to be carefully examined. Which also has resource implications, but making sure that the most vulnerable population during this particular time is not falling through the cracks because of their lack of access to the technology that they need in order to be successful.
Great place to wrap up. I feel like, maybe we'll come back to this, part 2 of this conversation, Christoph. Thanks so much for your valuable answers. I know they'll provide a lot of, insight and support for educators who are really hungry for it. This is Jessica Murray again for Engaging Students. Thanks again for joining us, Christoph. For more resources around engaging students, please visit us at engagingstudents.com. And for more information on Christoph, please see his bio and links on our site. And thank you to our viewers. Please let us know how we did in the comments and what you'd like to see more of. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. Take care.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.